Today's tutorial is all about soap carving. I will walk you through organic abstraction, subtractive carving, negative space, and all my strategies to carve a bar of soap using all 360 degrees of the soap. If you love learning about art, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a weekly tutorial. I'm using Ivory soap because it is inexpensive, and I'm going to start by sketching out what I would like my soap to look like. I'm tracing my soap on a white piece of paper, and I'm focusing on organic abstraction. Organic abstraction is a style of art that's characterized by the use of rounded, curvy shapes and forms based on what someone would find in nature. My students have been studying these artists, and you can see that some of them are super abstract, like the Barbara Hepworth, and then some are a little bit more representational, like the figures you see with Elizabeth Catlett and Henry Moore. You can use the techniques taught in this video to create a more representational sculpture. It could be an animal, a face, a cactus, really anything. But I will be focusing more on an abstract maquette, which is a model or a rough draft or unfinished sculpture that is used as a learning tool. I will be moving on to the much more challenging plaster carving after this, so I want my students to have lots of practice thinking this way, creating a subtractive carving, and focusing on abstract forms. With all that in mind, I'm creating a non-representational abstract sculpture. So I am looking mostly at Barbara Hepworth sculptures, and I do want to include at least one hole, opening, or negative space. Sometimes abstract art, especially non-representational art, can be very hard to understand. So I highly recommend studying this form, making sketches of other artists' work to learn the style, and then put your own spin on it. Once you're happy with your sketch, it's time to transfer the image. I will be using a technique I've done with clay before, and this is where you put a tracing paper or the sketch over the surface that you would like to transfer it to, and then you do dots to transfer the image without ripping or tearing your paper. So I'm using a toothpick. You could use a needle tool if you're in a classroom that uses sculpting and clay materials. And see how my paper's wrinkling? This is frustrating me, so I'm gonna actually cut out the sketch, put it on top. I've already transferred most of it. You can see the dots, but I think this will allow me to kind of work with it easier. You do want to transfer your sketch on both sides, so do the dot dot technique, and then that way you're not going to rip your paper. Now you could freehand it. You could even use a pencil and sketch your design directly into the soap, lightly carving. Do whatever technique feels best for you. My design is very simple. I could almost just kind of eyeball it. But when it comes to a carving, a subtractive sculpture, I have found that it's always best to have a game plan really in place before starting, because once you're carving something, you really can't get those pieces back. Once your image is transferred, it's time to start carving. I am using loop tools that came in my Jack Richardson sculpting kit. It's the same tools I use with clay. I'm also going to be using a toothpick, and I think I mentioned before, you can do this at home if you have a spoon, a butter knife, and like a shish kebab stick or toothpick for your small details. So I'm going to start by carving out the negative space or the openings on the side of the soap. One thing to keep in mind as you're working is always work on all sides at the same time. So don't think of it like front, back, side, and side. You want to try and make it as rounded as possible and have as many planes as possible. So a plane is a surface, so you don't want the front to just be flat. You want it to curve into the sides and the back of the sculpture. More on that later. You want to carve very slowly. I know it seems like I'm going fast, and I probably am going too fast because everything I do in my life, I rush through it. And I did speed up the timing of this video. Right now you're watching me carve at 1.4, so a time and a quarter, what I actually did. And you'll see me speed along in certain areas. I'll always let you know when I've sped up the timing of a video just for my viewers. My viewers are my teenage students, and they do not want to sit there and watch me carve something for 40 minutes straight. So I always kind of break things down into steps, zip along when it's a repeat, so you just get the general idea. I will say with carving, it is very satisfying. Just the tactile experience of removing a surface from another, there's something about that that's super satisfying. The soap especially smells really good, and it's just nice to touch. So be careful that you don't carve away too much. So speaking of planes, what I'm doing now is creating a surface in the front of my soap that isn't flat. So I'm not jumping straight into an opening or negative space, but I'm trying to open the sculpture up so it's not just one flat surface you could run your hand over, but it curves in and comes back out to create a more 360-degree in the round view. Round describes a sculpture that is freestanding and it's meant to be viewed from multiple angles. So that means every viewpoint isn't a front and a back, but you could walk around it and your eye would be engaged in how the form kind of goes into itself and isn't just flat like a painting you would hang on the wall. I think this is one of the hardest concepts for students to get. First, it's abstract, and second, how do you turn a rectangular bar of soap into something more rounded and more interesting from all angles? My best advice for that is to hold it in your hand, rotate it, and look at it from multiple angles, not just laying flat on the surface. You'll see me do that a bunch. Keep in mind that a sculpture won't be finished until it's finished, so it's not going to look like it's all the way done until it is. So you can see me kind of rotating it, looking at it from the different sides, and you see my recessed area that I sketched? So I'm carving that in, and then there's a second recessed area that I'm hoping to go all the way through with a hole. These loop tools aren't as sharp as some of the clay tools that I have, and these are really great. So I'm gonna put my link in the description box because these I have found have worked really well with soap. Let's hope they work well with plaster too. And you can see I'm kind of engaging the side into the front, smoothing it out, rounding it so that it kind of curves in and isn't just that angle. I'll be doing that quite a bit. I recommend not putting holes or openings in your sculpture until you've clearly carved some recessed areas. If you just try and drill down and make your hole or negative space right away, your soap could break. It's not the end of the world if it's just a learning tool, but it is kind of frustrating if you have a design in mind and then something breaks and you have to change it. Keep in mind, designs are meant to change. You're going to see by the end of this video that my sketch gets a lot more complicated and a lot more detail as I get more comfortable with the material. I'm having a lot of fun with this loop tool, smoothing out my edges, and it really is starting to not look as rectangular as it did when I first opened it up. Notice the Ivory soap logo is gone, right? You can't see that anymore, and it's starting to become an organic abstract shape. So I'm going to speed things up to twice the speed, so double time here, because I'm just repeating my steps. I'm smoothing things out, I'm rounding out my edges, and I'm focusing on creating recessed areas on the front, back, and sides of my sculpture. What I love now is I'm starting to forget what the front even is in the back, and that's exactly the place I want to be. You can see on the left-hand side that curve, how it curves into the front from the side, and I'm going to try and create as many areas of that as possible. So these little negative space or these recessed areas that I'm carving eventually will have the negative space or holes that go all the way through, but as I mentioned before, that's going to be one of the last things that I do. Now I'm working on the sides I haven't given as much attention to, and I know it looks like I'm going fast, and just a reminder, because sometimes people comment that, oh, you're going too fast. Remember, this is a repetition of things I've done before, so I'm speeding it up. The best teacher is experience. So watch what I do, but you're really only going to learn by trying it yourself. I'm going to keep this video in double time just because, again, I could obsessively sit here and do this all day. And I did tell my students when I was practicing, I could sit here and carve this bar of soap for hours. It is so satisfying. I'm loving the smell. And I'm slowly kind of digging out. You can see I almost went all the way through with my toothpick. I'm slowly digging out those openings and those areas of negative space. I have found the toothpick to be a very useful tool, as you can see me carving away that negative space. And what I love about it is that you can really get some refined edges, you can go through small areas, and if you don't have a needle tool, which I have tons of them in the classroom, but you might not, and also, you might be doing this at home, a toothpick works really great, anything with a sharp point. I'm really enjoying at this point how my recessed area has a recessed area, which then has negative space in there. So the more areas of depth and the more kind of overlapping sections you can create, the better. This section I'm working on the side, I'm trying to curve into that recessed area to make my back to side to front connection visually kind of flow together. I really do feel great about the rounded edges, but I'm going to try and include more areas that flow visually from one plane to the next. Now that my soap feels really multidimensional, I am going to focus more on those holes and going all the way through from one plane to the next or from one side to the next. Remember, the negative space doesn't just have to go from front to back. I'm going to try and create these areas that kind of have negative space from like side to front. And I have some students working on this now who have created such beautiful and intricate sculptures. I have slowed down the pace just a little bit just so that you can see me in more real time how I'm doing this. So the loop tools are really convenient for the recessed areas and for carving through, but keep in mind, unless you want a really big hole, use a smaller pointier shape for that. And you definitely want to go slow and kind of build to those areas. You can see I'm creating another recessed area, which I am going to try and put a hole that kind of connects through. We'll see if that works. And again, you can see me turning the sculpture, focusing on adding details to the sides and edges. One trick I learned on the internet is you can use water and a brush to smooth out your line. So I'm going to try that here. I'm using a brush and a jar of water, and watch my fail. You can see the blue paint that kind of set down in my cup here. That's totally going to transfer on the white soap. You'll see it momentarily. Yep, there it is. So it makes kind of like a bluish green area. I will be honest, I didn't love this technique quite as much. I feel like it kind of muddied up my lines a little bit, if that makes sense. I do, I'm using my hands more than the brush here just to kind of smooth it out. But I found with the loop tool that I have, I was able to smooth it out just with the edge of the loop tool. If you're doing this at home and you don't have access to those tools, feel free. But look at the difference here. The one on the right, I use no water. And then the one on the left, I use water and a brush. I prefer the texture on the right, but it's completely up to what tools you have and what your sensibilities as an artist are. How to know you're finished? That is a question I always struggle with, and at this point, it's really up to me. I have negative space. I've transformed this shape from a rectangle to more of a three-dimensional in the round sculpture. It is an example of organic abstraction. All the goals that I had for myself, and I feel really well practiced for this subtractive carving technique, because when my students move on to plaster, I want to make sure that I feel comfortable teaching and doing the technique myself. So I'm just doing a few little cleanups here, especially because I feel like the brush kind of like pushed closed some of those openings. So I'm just doing a few last minute cleanups. It's not so much that I am adding more detail, but I'm refining the details I already have. And although I could sit here and carve this soap until it didn't exist anymore, I'm going to try and have restraint and just wrap this up in the next couple minutes. So again, I am just focusing on refining my details, adding any little area if I feel like a side or section of the sculpture doesn't have a lot of attention to it. And if I wanted, I could glue this bad boy down to a piece of wood and have it a finished work of art. I could even spray it with a clear coat. But again, this is just a maquette, which is a small unfinished practice sculpture that will lead me into more challenging materials, which I will be headed to next. So I'm going to wrap things up here, and I feel like my brain is really open to abstract ideas. I feel like my hands are really used to the carving and subtractive technique. Smells great in my classroom with all these soap shavings everywhere. Speaking of the soap shavings, you can keep them and actually press them together and make more soap, or it can be trash. It depends on, how you view it. I'm just going to end up putting mine in the trash can. Okay, I'm going to force myself to stop before this whole soap disappears. Thank you so much for sticking around and making art with me. And if you're interested in more 3D tutorials, check these out. Also, find me on Instagram at thatartteacher_Machado to find out what my students are currently doing in the classroom. And if you're looking for full-length lesson plans and student examples, find my website at thatartteacher.com.